Isabella recognized that the surest way to curb the disorders which pervaded her kingdom was the vigorous enforcement of the law, and as soon as the favorable aspect of the War of the Succession gave her leisure for less pressing matters, she set earnestly to work to accomplish it. The victory of Toro was followed immediately by the Cortes of Madrigal, April 27, 1476, where far-reaching reforms were enacted, among which the administration of justice and the vindication of the royal prerogatives occupied a conspicuous place. It was not long before she gave her people a practical illustration of her inflexible determination to enforce these reforms. In 1477 she visited Seville with her court and presided in public herself over the trial of malefactors. Complaints came in thick and fast of murders and robberies committed in the bad old times. The criminals were summarily dispatched, and a great fear fell upon the whole population, for there was scarce a family, or even an individual, who was not compromised. Multitudes fled, and Seville bade fair to be depopulated, when at the supplication of a great crowd, headed by Enrique de Guzman, Duke of Medina Sidonia, she proclaimed an amnesty conditioned on the restitution of property, making, however, the significant exception of heresy. From Seville she went, accompanied by Ferdinand, to Cordova. There they executed malefactors, compelled restitution of property, took possession of the castles of robber hidalgos, and left the land pacified. As opportunity allowed, in the busy years which followed, Isabella visited other portions of her dominions, from Valencia to Biscay and Galicia, on the same errand, and, when she could not appear in person, she sent judges around with full powers to represent the crown, the influence of which was further extended when, in 1480, the royal officers, known as corregidors, were appointed in all towns and cities. One notable case is recorded which impressed the whole nobility with salutary terror. In 1480 the widow of a scrivener appealed to her against Alvar Iñañez, a rich caballero of Lugo in Galicia, who, to obtain possession of a coveted property, caused the scrivener to forge a deed, and then murdered him to ensure secrecy. It was probably this which led Ferdinand and Isabella to send to Galicia Fernando de Acuña as governor with an armed force, and Garci López de Chinchilla as corregidor. Iñañez was arrested and finally confessed, and offered to purchase pardon with 40,000 ducats to be applied to the Moorish wars. Isabella's counselors advised acceptance of the tempting sum for so holy a cause, but her inflexible sense of justice rejected it. She had the offender put to death, but to prove her disinterestedness, she waived her claim to his forfeited estates and gave them to his children. Alvar Iñañez was but a type of the lawless nobles of Galicia, who, for a century, had been accustomed to slay and spoil without accountability to anyone. So desperate appeared the condition of the land that when, in 1480, the deputies of the towns assembled to receive Acuña and Chinchilla, they told them that they would have to have powers from the King of Heaven, as well as from the earthly king, to punish the evildoers of the land. The example made of Iñañez brought encouragement, but the work of restoring order was slow. Even in 1482, the representatives of the towns of Galicia appealed to the sovereigns, stating there had been long neither law nor justice there, and begging that a Justicia Mayor be appointed, armed with full powers to reduce the land to order. They especially asked for the destruction of the numerous castles of those who, having little land and few vassals to support them, lived by robbery and pillage, and with them they classed the fortified churches held by prelates. At the same time they represented that homicide had been so universal that if all murderers were punished, the greater part of the land would be ruined, and they suggested that culprits be merely made to serve at their own expense in the war with Granada. With the support of the well-disposed, however, the royal power gradually made itself felt. They lent efficient support to the royal representatives. 46 robber castles were razed, and 1,500 robbers and murderers fled from the province, which became comparatively peaceful and orderly. A change confirmed when, in 1486, Ferdinand and Isabella went thither personally to complete the work. Yet it was not simply by spasmodic effort that the protection of the laws was secured for the population. Constant vigilance was exercised to see that the judges were strict and impartial. In 1485, 1488, and 1490, we hear of searching investigations made into the actions of all the corregidors of the kingdom, to see that they administered justice without fear or favor. Jueces de residencia, as they were called, armed with almost full royal authority, were dispatched to all parts of the kingdom, as a regular system, to investigate and report on the conduct of all royal officials, from governors down, with power to punish for injustice, oppression, or corruption, subject always to appeal in larger cases to the royal council, and the detailed instructions given to them show the minute care exercised over all details of administration. Bribery also, which was almost universal in the courts, was summarily suppressed, and all judges were forbidden to receive presents from suitors. To maintain constant watchfulness over them, a secret service was organized of trustworthy inspectors, who circulated throughout the land in disguise and furnished reports as to their proceedings and reputation. Attention, moreover, was paid to the confused jurisprudence of the period. Since the confirmation of the Siete Partidas of Alfonso X in 1348, and the issue at the same time of the Ordenamiento de Alcalá, there had been countless laws and edicts published, some of them conflicting, and many that had grown obsolete, though still legally in force. The greatest jurist of the day, Alfonso Diaz de Montalvo, was employed to gather from these into a code all that were applicable to existing conditions, and further to supplement their deficiencies, and this code, known as the Ordenanzas Reales, was accepted and confirmed by the Cortes of Toledo in 1480. This reconstruction of Castilian jurisprudence was completed for the time when, in 1491, Montalvo brought out an edition of the Siete Partidas, noting what provisions had become obsolete and adding what necessary of the more modern laws. The result of all these strenuous labors is seen in the admiring exclamation of Peter Martyr in 1492, "Thus we have peace and concord, hitherto unknown in Spain. Justice, which seems to have abandoned other lands, pervades these kingdoms." The inestimable benefits resulting from this are probably due more especially to Isabella. Yet I have been led to the conviction that her share in the administration of her kingdom has been exaggerated. The chroniclers of the period were for the most part Castilians, who would naturally seek to subordinate the action of the Aragonese intruder, and subsequent writers, in their eagerness to magnify the reputation of Isabella, have followed example. In the copious royal correspondence with the officials of the Inquisition, the name of Isabella rarely appears. To these in Castile, as in Aragon, Ferdinand mostly writes in the first person singular, without even using the pluralis majestatis. The receiver of confiscations is mi receptor. The royal treasury is mi camera e fisco. The council of the Inquisition is mi consejo. In spite of the agreement of 1474, the signature yo la reina rarely appears alongside of yo el rey, but still rarer are Ferdinand's allusions to la serenísima reina, mi muy cara y muy amada mujer, while in the occasional letters issued by Isabella during her husband's absence, she is careful to adduce his authority as that of el rey mi señor. It is scarcely likely that this preponderance of Ferdinand was confined to directing the affairs of the Holy Office. There has been a tendency of late to regard the Inquisition as a political engine for the conversion of Spain from a medieval feudal monarchy to one of the modern absolute type, but this is an error. The change effected by Ferdinand and Isabella and confirmed by their grandson, Charles V, was almost wholly wrought, as it had been 2 centuries earlier in France, by the extension and enforcement of the royal jurisdiction, superseding that of the feudatories. In Castile, the latter had virtually ceased to be an instrument of good during the long period of turbulence which preceded the accession of Isabella. Something evidently was needed to fill the gap. The zealous and efficient administration of justice which I have described not only restored order to the community, but went far to exalt the royal power, and while it abased the nobles, it reconciled the people to possible usurpations which were so beneficent. In the consolidation and maintenance of this, no agency was so effective as the institution known as the Santa Hermandad. Hermandades, brotherhoods or associations for the maintenance of public peace and private rights, were no new thing. In the troubles of 1282, caused by the rebellion of Sancho IV against his father, the first idea of his supporters seems to have been the formation of such organizations. In these associations, however, the police functions were subordinated to the political object of supporting the pretensions of Sancho IV, and, recognizing their danger, he dissolved them as soon as he felt the throne assured to him. After his death, his widow, the regent, Doña Maria de Molina, organized them anew for the protection of her child, Fernando IV, and again in 1315, when she was a second time regent in the minority of her grandson, Alfonso XI. The idea was a fruitful one, and speedily came to be recognized as a potent instrumentality in the struggle with local disorder and violence. Perhaps the earliest Hermandad of a purely police character, similar to the later ones, was that entered into in 1302 between Toledo, Talavera, and Villarreal to repress the robberies and murders committed by the Golfines in the district of Zara. Fernando IV not only confirmed the association, but ordered the inhabitants to render it due assistance, and subsequent royal letters of the same purport were issued in 1303, 1309, 1312, and 1315. In 1386, Juan I framed a general law providing for the organization and functions of hermandades, but if any were formed under it at the time, they have left no traces of their activity. In 1418, this law was adopted as the constitution of one which organized itself in Santiago, but this accomplished little, and in 1421 the guilds and the confraternities of the city united in another for mutual support and succor. There was, in fact, at this time, at least nominally, a general hermandad, probably organized under the statute of Juan I, and possessing written charters and privileges and customs and revenues with full jurisdiction to try and condemn offenders. It commanded little respect, however, for it complained in 1418 to Juan II of interference with its revenues and work, in response to which Juan vigorously prohibited all royal and local judges and officials from impeding the hermandades in any manner. The continuity, nominal at least, of this with subsequent organizations is shown by the confirmation of this utterance by Juan II in 1423, by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1485, by Juana la Loca in 1512 and 1518, by Philip II in 1561, by Philip III in 1601, and by Philip IV in 1621. In the increasing disorder of the times, however, it was impossible at that period to maintain the efficiency of the body. In 1443 an attempt was made to reconstruct it, but as soon as it endeavored to repress the lawless nobles and laid siege to Pedro Lopez in Ayala, in Salvatierra, its forces were cut to pieces and dispersed by Pedro Fernandez de Velasco. Some 20 years later, in 1465, when the disorders under Henry IV were culminating, another effort was made. The suffering people organized and taxed themselves to raise a force of 1,800 horsemen to render the roads safe, and they endeavored to bring the number up to 3,000. It was a popular movement against the nobles, and the king hailed it as the work of God, who was lifting up the humble against the great. He empowered them to administer justice without appeal, except to himself. He told them that they had well earned the name of Santa Hermandad, and he urged them earnestly to go forward in the good work. The attempt had considerable success for a time, but it soon languished and was dissolved for lack of the means required to carry it on. Again, in 1473, there was another endeavor to form a Hermandad, but the anarchical forces were too dominant for its successful organization. As soon as the victory of Toro in March 1476 gave promise of settled government, the idea of reviving the Hermandades occurred to Alfonso de Quintanilla, contador mayor or chief auditor of Ferdinand and Isabella. With their approval, he broached the subject to leading citizens of the principal towns in Leon and Old Castile. Deputies were sent to meet at Dueñas, and the project was debated. So many obstacles presented themselves that it would have been abandoned but for an eloquent argument by Quintanilla. His plan was adopted, but so fearful were the deputies that the taxes necessary for its maintenance might become permanent, that they limited its duration to 3 years. Under the impulse of the sovereigns it rapidly took shape, and was organized with the Duke of Villahermosa, natural brother of Ferdinand, at its head. No time was lost in extending it throughout the kingdom. In spite of resistance on the part of those who regarded with well-founded apprehension not only its efficiency as a means of coercing malefactors, but as a dangerous development of the royal power. Seville, for instance, recalcitrated, and only yielded to a peremptory command from Isabella in June 1477. One of the reasons assigned in 1507 by Ferdinand for assenting to the demoralizing arrangement under which the Archbishop of Compostela resigned his see in favor of his natural son was that he had received the royal judges and the Hermandad throughout his province in opposition to the will of the nobles and gentry. When in 1479 Alonso Carrillo and the Marquis of Villena made a final attempt to urge the King of Portugal to another invasion of Castile, one of the arguments advanced was the hatred entertained for Ferdinand and Isabella in consequence of the taxes levied to support the 3,000 horsemen of the Hermandad. In some provinces the resistance was obstinate. In 1479 we find Isabella writing to the authorities of Biscay, expressing surprise at the neglect of the royal orders and threatening condign punishment for further delay, notwithstanding which repeated commands were requisite, and it was not till 1488 that the stubborn Biscayans submitted, while soon afterward complaints came from Guipuzcoa that the local courts neutralized it by admitting appeals from its sentences. It was in the same year that Ferdinand obtained from the Cortes of Saragossa assent to the introduction of the Hermandad in his kingdom of Aragon, but the Aragonese, always jealous of the royal power, chafed under it, for in December 1493 Isabella, writing from Saragossa, expresses a fear that the Cortes may suppress it, though it is the only means of enforcing justice there, and in the Cortes of Moño in 1510 Ferdinand was obliged to approve a fuero, abolishing it and forbidding for the future anything of the kind to be established. In 1490 the independent kingdom of Navarre adopted the system and cooperated with its neighbors by allowing malefactors to be followed across the border and extraditing them when caught, even absconding debtors being thus tracked and surrendered. The institution thus founded was watched with Isabella's customary care. In 1483 complaints arose of bribery and extortion when she summoned a convention at Pinto of representatives from all the provinces, where the guilty were punished and abuses were reformed. The Santa Hermandad thus formed a mounted military police which covered the whole kingdom, under the Duke of Villahermosa, who appointed the captains and summoned the force to any point where trouble was threatened. Each centre of population elected 2 alcaldes, one a gentleman and the other a taxpayer or commoner, and levied a tax to defray the expense of the organization. The alcaldes selected the cuadrilleros or privates and held courts which dispensed summary justice to delinquents, bound by no formalities and required to listen to no legal pleadings. Their decision was final, save an appeal to the throne. Their jurisdiction extended over all crimes of violence and theft, and they could inflict stripes, mutilation, or death by shooting with arrows. The cuadrillero, in pursuit of an offender, was required to follow him for 5 leagues, raising the hue and cry as he went, and joined by those of the country through which he passed, who kept up the hunt until the fugitive was either caught or driven beyond the frontier. Great as were the services of the Hermandad in repressing the turbulence of the nobles and rendering the roads safe, its cost was a source of complaint to the communities which defrayed it. This was by no means small. In 1485 it was computed at 32 million maravedis, and subsequently it increased greatly. It was met by a tax of 18,000 maravedis on every 100 hearths, and the money was not handled by the communities but was paid to the crown. Nominally the organization was in their hands, but virtually it was controlled by the sovereigns, and when, in 1498, Ferdinand and Isabella, with an appearance of generosity, relieved the taxpayers and assumed to meet the expenses from the royal revenues, although they left the election of the alcaldes and the cuadrilleros in the hands of the local populations. Yet the result was inevitable in subjecting it still more closely to the crown. The institution became permanent, and its modern development is seen in the Guardia Civil. None of the reforms of Ferdinand and Isabella was so efficient in restoring order, and none did more to centralize power. It was not only a rudimentary standing army which could be concentrated speedily to suppress disorder, but it carried the royal jurisdiction into every corner of the land, and made the royal authority supreme everywhere. It was practically an alliance between the crown and the people against the centrifugal forces of feudalism, without which even the policy of Ferdinand and the iron firmness of Ximenes might have failed to win in the final struggle. When municipal independence likewise perished in the defeat of the comunidades, the only power left standing in Spain was that of the throne, which thus became absolute and all-pervading. The new absolutism was embodied in the self-effacing declaration of the Cortes of Valladolid in 1523 to Charles V that the laws and customs were subject to the king, who could make and revoke them at his pleasure, for he was the living law. How immense was the revolution, and how speedily accomplished, is seen in the contrast between the time when the Count of Benavente jeered at a royal safe conduct, and the people of Galicia scarce dared to receive a royal commissioner, and some 60 years later, when, in the unruly Basque provinces, the people of San Sebastian in 1536 appealed to the Emperor Charles V to relieve them from local nuisances, and royal letters were gravely issued forbidding the butchers of that town from erecting new stalls or skinning cattle in the streets, and restricting the latter operation to places duly assigned for the purpose. Thus the crown had become absolute, and its interposition could be invoked for the minutest details of local government. He reads history to little purpose who imagines that this was the work of the Inquisition. Another measure of no little importance in establishing the royal supremacy was the virtual incorporation in the crown of the masterships of the three great military orders of Santiago, of Calatrava, and of Alcantara. Under Henry IV, a master of Santiago had been able to keep the whole kingdom in confusion, and the wealth and power of the others, although not so great, were sufficient to render their chiefs the equals of the highest nobles. From Innocent VIII, in 1489, Ferdinand procured a brief granting him for life the administration of all three, and in her will Isabella bequeathed to him an annual income of 10 millions of maravedis from their revenues. As Ferdinand's death drew near, the orders endeavored to be released from subjection, claiming that they could be governed only by their own members, but prudent care secured in the time from Leo X the succession of the masterships to Charles V, who, after Leo's death, made haste to obtain from Adrian VI a bull which annexed them in perpetuity to the crown. It was impossible that a king so far-seeing and politic as Ferdinand, and a queen so pious as Isabella, when reducing to order the chaos which they found in Castile, should neglect the interest of the faith on which, according to medieval belief, all social order was based. There were, in fact, burning religious questions which, to sensitive piety, might seem even more urgent than protection of life and property. To comprehend the intricacy of the situation will require a somewhat extended retrospect into the relations between the several races occupying the peninsula. End of Book 1, Chapter 1, Part 3. Recording by B.G. Oxford.